Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, of course, to Alejandro, the Embassy, Bank of America, who today host us, our sponsors, and, of course, to all of you for coming here. I'm going to start by mentioning that the Minister Caputo is way too humble. I'm going to give you a couple of numbers of what has happened in Argentina. First year of Mille's presidency, the economy grew 6.6%. That's December 23, December 24. Second year, Argentina grew 3.5%, December 24, December 25. And we had a little bit of a political shock during this year, and yet the economy grew 3.5%. So a little bit like, maybe we're moving to that Italian style, where the politics is a bit of a mess, but the economy, I don't know if we are conscientious of how the economy grew in the context of such political instability. I think that's definitely remarkable. If you look at the expectations that the central bank publishes, el Reglamento de Expectativas de Mercados, the economy is poised to grow in the near future at a rate of 1% quarterly. If that were to continue until the end of Mille's first term, Mille would finish his first term with the economy growing 20% after 15 years of stagnation. So I think it's pretty notable. Let me make a mention on jobs. In the first 2 years of Mille's presidency, 400,000 jobs were created. 400, this is not very much in the agenda, 400,000. Actually, if you think for a second, that's very natural that occurred because about 200,000 people enter the labor force every year. The labor force participation has grown, and the unemployment rate has been falling. So that in itself is telling you that the economy is creating around at the rate of 200,000 jobs per year. Inflation has come down. Poverty has come down as a result. Remember, I was in my academic life when I was doing my PhD in economics, I worked in an area called delayed stabilization. I'm sure there are a lot of people here who had seen this literature, and this literature basically worked on the basic that stabilizations were delayed because stabilizations were costly. So you had to pay a cost, and then people tried to delay the cost, and that's the reason stabilizations were delayed. But I think President Mille and Toto have shown that actually stabilizations have a benefit. And the benefit comes because when you reduce government expenditure, you reduce the taxes that you have to charge people for paying that expenditure. That's the reason money printing was reduced. That's the reason why inflation was reduced. That's why poverty was reduced. And that's certainly politically very sound, as he mentioned, because that's the reason we had the landslide victory in October of last year. So actually, they've shown that stabilization should be front-loaded, not delayed. I think that deserves a round of applause. Anyway, so congratulations, and it's an honor for us, all of us, to be in this team. I was mentioning yesterday in the cocktail that Mille has kind of 5 main themes. The idea of having a fiscal surplus is, of course, one which is essential. The second is economic freedom, which is, I'm going to do a double click on that in my presentation because my topic. I also said that having sound fiscal and having deregulation and having economic freedom is basically the foundation of having strong property rights in the economy, because if the government has weak finances, it's one way or the other going to affect your property rights sooner or later. And regulation is a way of cheaping out your freedom and the value of your property. So you have economic freedom and you have sound fiscal, you have sound property rights, which is a little bit one of the inputs that Argentina has been lacking over the last 50 years. We have an agenda on security, and we have an agenda on international relations. I call this the Kirno dummy, okay? I think in the last 6 months, Argentina has done more to open its economy than in the previous 50 years. Not only the free trade agreement with EFTA, the free trade agreement, of course, with Mercosur and European Union, and the trade agreement with the US. I mean, never in the previous 50 years we've done so much to open up the economy as what has happened in the last 6 months in Argentina. So great job of Pablo, and of course of the leadership of the president. Okay, so I'm gonna double click on the economic freedom, but I brought a couple of slides. This is the first one I want to show you, which has to do with this combination of fiscal soundness and deregulation. When the graph on the right is basically the deregulations that have been implemented. You see how it's a curve that has been growing. And the one on the left, and the one on the right is, which I want to focus here on, is the number of public employees that have been laid off. So it's in comparison with December of 2023. So this bar, which is negative, means the difference in the number of employees vis-a-vis December of 23. And what I think is notable of both these graphs is the speed at which things are happening and the fact that we are, and some say, it's not stopping. It's not stopping. So our efforts to streamline the government, to eliminate efficiencies, to eliminate inefficiencies, to reduce the payroll, and to eliminate regulations is unabated. I mean, the president at the beginning of this year says, guys, when did you start? Okay, I think maybe that's an exaggeration, but it gives you the tone of the, so with 65,000 public employees, 20% of the labor force of the centralized administration and public enterprises can be laid off. No effect whatsoever on the quality of the services provided. It was just pure inefficiency, a government that had been bloated, overgrown, and had been, as I said, overgrown ridiculously. Okay, so let me leave that for a second. Let me talk about the rationale for economic freedom. As was said, it's not about simplification. It's not about modernization. It's about elimination. President Mille says, never think about simplifying something before asking yourself perhaps the more difficult but more essential question of whether that thing that you're aiming to simplify should be there at all or not. So first we need to know, do we need this? Okay, and this basically takes us to what is the rationale for most of the regulations that we have in the economy. And we tend to think, as economists, we tend to think that regulations are created by a central planner, which is thinking about how to do good. Well, nothing further from the truth. What I found when you review the regulations, that most of the regulations have been designed by someone, but was not trying to do the good for society at large, but the good for himself or herself, which is quite different. Okay? Most of the regulations have an interest behind which uses the power of the state to create a regulation which generates a privilege and a benefit for them. And I'm going to illustrate it with one of the most amazing examples that we have in Argentina, which also shows what can happen in an economy when you let them be free, which is the fact that before Mille came to government, there was a regulation that forbid satellite internet, the usage of satellite internet. You say, what the heck? Why would a society prohibit the use of satellite internet? You know, if you take Argentina and you place it over Europe, it goes from Portugal to Estonia, and we have 47 million people. So in that vast surface, very thinly populated, certainly you're never going to get with a fiber optic cable to everybody, so you definitely need this technology. And this technology costs nothing because the technology is there. There was a piece of paper which says you cannot do it. And you think that this was because someone was thinking how to benefit the millions of Argentines? No, this was something which was protecting their business of internet provision. So this was a regulation which was evil. It was a regulation done to damage the population at large. Let's connect that with the message of President Mille yesterday in his speech. But to benefit a tiny few or a particular corporation, etc. So in 2023, the number of users of satellite internet is the graph on the left, which is 0. And Javier Milei, in his 10th day in government, he basically tears apart that piece of paper, allows for satellite internet to be provided. That's the number of customers in 24, and that's the number of customers in 25. Today, close to 3 million people in Argentina get their services of internet through Starlink, particularly. Zero cost for the government. Strongly federalizing the country, because now anybody in Argentina, however far they are, they can get the same quality of internet as in the city of Buenos Aires. So I think this is a great example. We also have to fight against our idea, because I think we're somehow being a little bit brainwashed in terms of regulation. I like to illustrate it with an example, which is the following. I'm going to ask the audience, which is the most dangerous contract that we sign in our lives? The most risky, Marriage, correct? Marriage. Okay, marriage. Okay, yeah, you get into a relationship, you put all your wealth at stake with someone you barely know anything about, okay? Anyway, so very dangerous thing for people to do alone, on their free will. You know, there are kids in the middle, you have divorces. I mean, the people are left with the parents, split families. We cannot let this happen unregulated, so we're going to regulate this market. So I'm going to do the following. I'm going to create a registry of brides and grooms, or potential brides and grooms. If you marry not being in the register, it's illegal, okay? It's an illegal marriage, okay? Now, because this is such a dangerous thing, we're going to create a government agency with marriage producers which are going to generate the matches, okay? So you have to hire and pay a fee, a government fee. It's a small fee because it's a public service. You're going to pay a small fee to get the kind of these guys help you, okay? Or okay, they're going to do the match. And if you get married through the auspices of this government official, you have a contract. The government will give you a contract, okay, and says how much sex per week, who washes the dishes, who takes the kids to school, etc. All the things that have to do with marriage, okay? And we laugh, and you're all laughing because we think this is totally absurd. In fact, we believe that the government has nothing to do with telling you who you should marry, neither the sex of the person you marry, nor the age, nor the wealth, nor the psychological trait or whatever, or if they have penal, antecedentes penales. We say, no, the government has nothing to do. It's part of freedom. It's part of life. It's part of the living your life freely, okay? So we think this makes absolutely no sense. Now, if you want to buy insurance, which is a contract to reduce your risk, I subject you to all that regulation. So for marriage, no. But for insurance, which is something that's an adult, I'm buying to reduce my risk, I have to do it with a regulated company. I have to sign a contract written by the bureaucrat. I have to hire a producer of insurance, which is a guy which is authorized by the government. Why? Well, it's totally inconsistent. If you believe you have to regulate the insurance business and not let people freely decide how they want to dilute their risk, then you should read about it. So we somehow win a little bit brainwashed. So I think that is kind of, we have this view in our mind, and that really kind of pushes us to be very critical and very aggressive in terms of deregulation. Now, I want to connect the deregulation agenda with something that Toto said, which is, he said, one of the most fundamental questions they asked me is about sustainability of the reforms. And Toto's answer was, they are sustainable because now there's political will. We're doing this out of our free choice, not of a necessity or of a crisis. And he also said that there's popular support, which I would add, Toto, something that I've heard you said before, that if you look at the under 35, Mille carries 75% of the vote. So if you project that going forward, I mean, the political support seems to be stronger. So I want to complement this question of sustainability with a different perspective, which is the following. Argentina has been for many years a status quo society. The reason it was kind of locked is because there were people that didn't want it to change. I mean, you don't construct the closest economy in the world out of just by coincidence. No, there's someone who is pushing, and they want, and they prefer the economy to be the closest economy in the world. Okay? So I developed this metaphor, which is called that Argentina was drowning itself in its own Bermuda Triangle. You know the Bermuda Triangle, correct? So we were drowning ourselves, and in the angles of the Bermuda Triangles, you have what I call three blocking agents. These are the agents that don't want change. And the three blocking agents for me were the unions on one side, the crony capitalism, of which Mille referred to yesterday in his speech, which is not all the business community, correct? But there are some, and the Peronist Party, because the Peronist Party is the caretaker of this status quo system. So to ensure sustainability, we have to weaken these three blocking agents. Okay, I say in the last 6 months, we've done tremendous impact in weakening the three blocking agents. And I'll explain the three blocking agents. So the Peronist Party. How did we weaken the Peronist Party? With something that we still don't believe how we managed to do it, which was that in 2024, we passed in Congress a law which is you vote with a single paper ballot. And by voting with a single paper ballot, it's more difficult to do fraud in the election. And we always knew that these Kirchneristas guys, they were tricking a little bit. But we thought maybe 1%, 2%, 3% at most. But no, apparently it was much, much more. So when they went to the election to vote with a single paper ballot, an election that they had won 2 months before in the province of Buenos Aires, they lost. In Tucumán, they thought it was going to be 70-30, and it was 40-40. Talking of the places where there's more of this thing. So the paper ballot has reduced the structural size of the Peronist electoral power. I say they lost gravitational pull. You know, they've lost gravity. That's why all the asteroids, they're losing their asteroids, okay? Because now they have a lower gravitational pull. So I think that's a structural reform which basically weakens that blocking agent. The labor reform, Toto talked about some of the issues which have to do with the labor market, but there's a different dimension to the labor reform, which is very essential, which is the way labor negotiations are conducted. We've basically allowed that firm negotiation prevails over the national-wide union-led agreement, and this basically undermines the power of the unions. Maybe it doesn't happen tomorrow, maybe it doesn't happen next year, but it's going to happen in the next few years. So the labor reform for me is essential, not so much because of the economic dimension of the labor market, which of course is there, but because there's a political dimension that it weakens the power of one of the most essential blocking agents of the economy. And at the Kirno-Dami and the deregulation effort, which is opening up the economy, deregulating, generating competition, that weakens the rent of the crony capitalism and therefore weakens their power to block reforms. Okay? And all these things, I mean, the openness of the economy, the regulation is of course happening, the labor reform, the paper ballot that we've seen its effect on the October election, the three blocking agents, I would say for the first time, I see we've kind of managed to, how do you say, to put a punch on them. Of course, we don't have to lower the guard, correct? We don't have to lower the guard, not for a single minute, but certainly I see progress. So I like to see that the regulation agenda is having like these two layers. There's the economist layer. We want competition because we believe in the benefits of markets, we believe in the benefits of competition, but there's an underlying deeper political economy dimension to the deregulation, which is that of economic reform and labor reform and all the reforms we're going to do this year, which is that it weakens the power of the blocking agents. Okay, I think that Toto, to complement the arguments that you were saying about the sustainability. Okay, so let me just say, I think I'm kind of running out of time, so let me just give you a few examples of the regulations, because listen, we found the most absurd things. Absurd things. Let's give you an example. For example, in the navigation codes, you basically force boats to have a complement electricity equipment. So the argument is, if you have a boat and you go 4,000 miles into the South Atlantic and then you lose your power, well, you're all gonna die, okay, if you don't have electricity. So you need to have a kind of a supplementary electricity generator. So I would say, look, if you have a boat of $200 million, and you're going to put a crew of 100 on the boat, and you're going to go 4,000 miles into the South Atlantic, I think you know what the fuck you're doing, okay? That's not something that I wake in the morning and I go out. So I think you know you have to have, okay, let me accept it anyway. Let it pass. But then the regulation forced the same thing on the boat that sails in the Paraná River in the Delta. And the guy from the Paraná River says, look, I never are further than 10 meters from the coast. So if I lost electricity, I throw a rope and I say, cacho, tirame, and okay, I go to the coast. And having this electricity generator doubles the cost of my boat. This is the kind of absurdity that we have, okay? So, so let me show you a couple of things which are fun. One of the things that we did is we deregulated the airline market. Now you can have, I think Fabian was around there somewhere. We deregulated, you can run, if you have a small plane, a 6-seater, a 19-seater, you can set up an airline and start flying. And today, 1.2 million Argentines have a commercial flight less than 50 kilometers from their home that did not exist when Javier Mille became president. And this is with small airlines which are flying small planes, because of course, if you're going to Tres Arroyos, you're never going to fly with a 747, correct? If they force you to fly with a 747, there's not a market for that. But there's a market for a 6-seater, okay? And this is a city, which is a small city, which is 7 hours from Buenos Aires, and very much could benefit from an air connection. So you're having all this is kind of sprinting like mushrooms throughout the country, so I think it's fun. One of our most famous examples is the elimination of rent control, which is, I think, is also a very interesting example from a philosophical point of view, because the reason there was rent control, there was a law which kind of established how leases had to be made, is because you thought that there was a symmetry between the person who was putting the apartment on the market and the person who was renting. And you say, oh, the person who's renting is weaker than the person who's putting the, it's like you're saying demand is weaker than supply. I mean, I never heard in economics that, supply is weaker or demand is weaker, and there's a supply and there's a demand. And there's an equilibrium price. And so when you buy into this argument and say, no, I'm going to put a law, which is you force that law onto everybody, on the premise of this asymmetry. The labor law, for example, you could have the same discussion. Why do we have a labor law? Why don't we let labor contracts to be free? And the basis of that is that you think that the worker is weaker than the employer. I'm not at all sure that that's the case. We didn't challenge that in the discussion of the labor law, but I think it's an issue that has to be discussed. I think it's an interesting philosophical question. When we eliminated all the restrictions on leases, everything, absolutely everything, nothing was left. It was a contract which was purely free. You could do the rent on whatever species, currency, time, whatever characteristics you would want to put on the contract, the price of rentals fell by 30%. So it seems that the highs which were putting the price, the apartment market, weren't that more powerful than the demand, because demand pushed the price down 30%. Okay, so here you have the I don't know, a laser here. No, sorry. So here you see, I don't know if you see here at the right, you have the dramatic fall in the price of rentals. And then you have this is perhaps, I'm running out of time, but let me just show you 3 more things. This is perhaps my preferred example, which is yerba mate, okay, which everybody here knows what yerba mate is. Very competitive industry, thousands of producers, thousands of distributors, hundreds of brands. So what does the government do when you have a competitive industry? It transforms it into a monopoly. So a lot of textbooks on antitrust, but we take a competitive industry, we create a board. I see Juan Paso here, we work on this, and Pablo Lavigne throughout this last year. You create a board so that everybody gets it, we fix the price. So in the executive decree 7023, Javier Milei eliminates the authority of the INIM, Instituto Nacional de Yerba Mate, to fix the price, and the price fell to half. So now we know that this board, what they were doing was doubling the price of yerba mate, which 46 million Argentines consume, to twice its price, okay? And I think it's a story that all is well when it ends well, because when the domestic price fell, the industry changed its chip and started looking outward, because outward you have 7 billion people. How can you have an industry that sells a product to 96% of Argentinian families, and to how many families that it sells the product in the US? To none. It's like you say, I have cell phones that I sell in one country, and then in another country people don't want cell phones. It doesn't make any sense. You have a market of, and now the production of yerba mate is record. The exports of yerba mate are record. By the way, there was also regulations which forbid people from increasing production. So this is the kind of things that we have. Now you forbid production. And so I think this is a fantastic example. Prices fall into half and an export boom. Then something which is interesting, my last 3 examples, is that the export of small and medium-sized firms are growing at an annual rate of 40%. And the economists say, oh, how can this happen with this exchange rate? They complain. And then you don't understand. It's like a disconnect there. And I think the economists are not seeing all the tremendous reduction in the cost that economic freedom and deregulation are doing. For example, we allow this, which is called the B-trenes. Okay? So basically, you move from a truck, which you could only take 1 container, to a truck that contains 2 containers. On the logistic chain, it reduces the cost 40%. Just that. Or for example, we allowed people to, which is one of the most fantastic, we have hundreds of stories, we've allowed something also which was forbidden, which was you could not import used capital goods. So I get not only in Vaca Muerta, where you take those vehicles, which are the rigs, which you basically bring used from somewhere else, you don't have to buy them new. But we have companies which are buying their capital at 1/6, 1/10 the price that they had before. And this was forbidden in Argentina. We were forbidding our firms to buy capital cheaply. So it's kind of insane. So let me finish with one, my most funny story. I apologize if someone has already heard this, but I finish with this, which was my watermelon story. And the story is like this. You know that I go on TV and I tell people, write to me and tell me all the ways the government is making your life miserable. Because for some of you here, we have a direct channel and you just bring me the list and we work on it, etc. But for the general public at large? So a guy writes to me an email and says, Federico, help me with my watermelons. Pretty cryptic, okay? So it was intriguing. So I wrote back to him and said, what's the problem with your watermelons? They don't taste any good. He says, no, my watermelons are fantastic. In fact, I'm an exporter of watermelons. Okay, so what's the problem that you have? No, the problem I have is that the government forces me to package the watermelons in a specific way. And for the last 10 years, I've been trying to convince the government that if I can package them another way, because my client abroad wants a different packaging, not the one the government wants. And he says, he writes to me, this is not plutonium, okay? This is not enriched uranium, so who fucking cares how the watermelons are packaged, okay? I'm trying to reproduce his words, okay, in the email. And I said, so at the end, you're not exporting the watermelons because, no, what I do is I package the watermelons the way the government says. I put them on the boat, and then the boat does 100 meters. I stop, I go out of the ports, 100 meters. I say, stop. I send 70 guys. They unpack, and they repack. And my eyes were swelling. They were already red while I'm reading this. And I tell my team, this has to be true, because if I try to imagine this story, I cannot make it up, okay? So it has to be true. Reality always surpasses imagination. And actually, we started working with Pablo Lavigne on this. We realized that this guy was just pointing to the tip of the iceberg. And beneath you had a tremendous amount of regulation. Look, you had to get a PhD in literature before becoming a fruit producer to read all the regulations. You couldn't start harvesting until a government official told you that you could start harvesting. Every single product had a lot of restrictions. You basically, look, you had the faucet, how do you say the faucet? La canilla. The faucet in your restroom had to have, el cabito, the thing had to have 12 centimeters height, okay? What's all this bullshit, okay? And there we basically eliminated everything. We talked with Senasa. We said, what are the things that have to be done with fruit? It was 2 things, which is through the regulation. We moved from 2.5 kilos of regulation to basically 50 grams of regulation, okay? So we measure regulations by weight, okay? It's just a way of measuring, okay? And so this guy sends me this video. He sends me a video a few weeks ago. This is the guy who had wrote to me, okay?
Hoy es un día histórico para la localidad de Juan José Castel y Chaco. Esta sandía es la primera sandía en la historia que se logra exportar al país vecino de Uruguay. Y queríamos darles las gracias exclusivas a nuestro presidente de la Nación, Javier Mille, a nuestro ministro de Desregulación, Federico Sturzenegger, porque sin ello esto no hubiese sido posible. Específicamente, Federico logró disolver muchas trabas burocráticas que teníamos en aduana, y hoy un sueño que se transformó en realidad, hoy es un hecho concreto. Esperemos exportar muchos equipos más. Así que, Federico, querido, infinitamente gracias, y este videito es para vos.
So this is, listen, I'll tell you something. I told this story to a New York reporter, which came to Argentina a few days, and he was trying to get a meeting with Javier Mille. Wasn't able to. He actually met with him 2 days ago. So he said, I said, I'm going to visit this guy. So he went to visit. So the guy from the New York Times report, he came back and said, this guy is the next president of Argentina. So anyway, but this is it. This is the story, no? The story of the amazing thousands of stories that are happening in Argentina, which is as a result of freedom. People are just trying to say, let us free, let us see. If you let us free, we'll do amazing things. And this is why the President Mille emphasizes so much the objective of economic freedom. Argentina will do great things. It will be not the government which will do it. The government just has to get out of the way. It will be the Argentine population will do fantastic things, and this is the quest in which we are. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that amazing conversation and for your examples. I really like the watermelons a lot, yeah. Federico. So you've answered a lot of my questions, but Argentina's undertaken liberalization programs before. You've tried to eliminate regulations before. Why do you think this time it's going to work, but not work while you're there?
Yeah.
Work forever.
No, I think this is Toto was trying to answer this question. I think this question is what you say is the one that he gets all the time, we get all the time. And I think it's both a combination of what Javier Mille calls the cultural battle, the idea of convincing Argentines on the value of freedom. And I think Susan, he's making quite significant progress in that respect. I mean, in the polls, people are open to the idea of freedom. They embrace the idea of freedom. We were mentioning that particularly the young people in Argentina are particularly keen because in Argentina, also remember, 2 million Argentines left before Mille came in the 10 years prior to Mille. So we had this sense of urgency that if we were to save our families, we need to do something which was very dramatic and very different. But then I would go back to what I was just mentioning, Susan, in my presentation. I mean, Argentina was tied in a trap of this society with blocking agents. I place, as I reviewed all the legal framework of Argentina, I placed this at the end of the 1960s. General Onganía, we had a general which basically set up this caste system. He put it in the law. And so we came to the conclusion, if you don't undo the legal architecture by which these guys obtain these privileges, you're never going to eliminate them, and they're going to be there as a blocking, like a resistance, you know? It's like the clergy and the landowners when the French Revolution came, okay? Those were the guys which were always trying to do the counter-revolution. I mean, these guys are there to always try to do the counter-revolution. So you need to undo the legal architecture, and you need to dilute their rents and their power so that they can act as blocking agents. And I think this is when Javier Mille established his campaign as, I'm going to fight against the caste system, this is what he's talking about. He's talking about a system which was being built to generate privileges for themselves, and this is the system that has to be undermined. By the way, this is not unique to Argentina. If you read Acemoglu Robinson, Why Nations Fail, basically, what the point they make is that in all the economies which are successful, there's an elite which tries to capture the rents of economic activity, and it's the societies that, in the case of Acemoglu Robinson, they say there are few societies who have managed to create what they called economic inclusive institutions, the Western world, Japan, some countries in East Asia, and I think this is what we need to do, okay? And so I think freedom, and such a focus on freedom and in opening the economy and deregulation, it's what's weakened the power of the blocking agents and what's going to make this sustainable.
That's great. So
let's hope it works.
Let's hope it works. But moving on from that, Argentina has deepened its economic ties with partners,
yep.
European Union, the United States, yep. Thank goodness. But there's a big topic that a lot of people have discussed, intellectual property. Yep. Which is the other side of the argument that you just made. When you don't protect intellectual property, then in fact you're doing exactly what you're trying to eliminate.
Correct.
So how is the government approaching strengthening Argentina's framework to support?
Well, I mean, intellectual property is another thing that needs to have property rights. For example, in Argentina, we have an issue with our seeds. For example, Brazil has tripled its production of soybean, of course, because it has expanded its agricultural frontier, but also because it uses seeds which are have been created by Argentine scientists in Argentine companies which sell the seeds in Brazil, but they can't sell them in Argentina. So Brazil is tripling the soybean production with our seeds, and we cannot have the seeds that we ourselves produce. Why? Because we don't have property rights on our seeds. So I think generating a better management of property rights for seed, maybe our agricultural production doubles in the next 15, 20 years. Can you have a cotton which produces 600 kilos in Chaco, and over Brazil, where they have a higher seed, the same geographical area produces 1,400 kilos. So you could double, triple the production of cotton in Chaco just by having better seeds. And we don't have that not because the seed is not there, because we don't have property rights. So it's just another example.
How do you fix that?
No. We have to basically set up the system to protect the property rights. And all the idea, I mean, the US has come to us with a very sensible approach. And they said, look, guys, if you want to be part of the world, you have to play with the rules of the world. So that means that you have to respect the property rights in the way, I mean, I'm not saying Denmark or Germany does it, in the way Chile does it, in the way Peru does it, in the way Colombia does it, in the way Brazil does it. I mean, we're not asking for something different than that. And I think having better protection of property rights, starting with PCT, for example, which is the Patent Cooperation Treaty, which is the filing system for patents, it would be the most important thing we could do for our scientific complex. You know, I mean, Argentine scientists in CONICET, they basically have to go to another country to patent because the patent in Argentina provides no global protection, so it's totally useless. Actually, it's negative because you make public your thing and you have no protection, so you never would do that there. CONICET actually has to go abroad to patent its product. So not being part of that Patent Cooperation Treaty has been perhaps the most damaging and devastating policy for our scientists in Argentina, wide. And also for the industry, because if you're a small industry, which the guy invents a valve or whatever, we have very creative entrepreneurs in Argentina. And then they have to go to Delaware, they have to go to Brazil to patent. I mean, it's amazing the country not allowing their own people to be able to defend their property right, no? And not providing the institutions for that to happen. So I think this year we're going to move ahead with seeds, we're going to move ahead with PCT, and we're going to, again, it's going to be the biggest progress that we have for our technology and scientific world in probably 50 years. So,
I mean, you have a biotech industry, which is really complicated.
Absolutely.
They have to go to the United States to get
Absolutely. Well, there are scientists in CONICET, they have to go to Brazil, but then the guy in Brazil charges them 10-15% of the equity just to file, because so we can't allow that to happen to our scientists.
And so are there other examples of deregulation in your mind spurring innovation, which then spurs economic?
Yeah, sometimes it's difficult to measure on a day-to-day basis. I'll give you an example. There are some funny examples. Like, for example, Toto at some point, look at this story, which is amazing. You know, we have a lot of cows. We kill the cows. We like meat, you know, if you want to Buenos Aires, you know this, okay?
You also milk the cows.
But anyway,
You also milk cows, right?
Milk?
Yeah.
Yeah, we also milk cows, yes, of course. And so in the 1990s, we had a president which was placed as president by the leather industry, which was Carlos Menem. You know, his cousin was Joe Macurtiembres, okay? So there was a system which basically that the export tax for leather was very high. Why? To make leather domestically very cheap. If you put an export tax, which is very high, the domestic price falls, correct? Basically to zero, and it was also with a trick because the reference price was a crazy price. It was like Louis Vuitton leather, okay, or something like that, okay? And so the price was so low and the leather industry could not take the leather, the slaughterhouses had to dispose of the leather that they could not use. So you have a good, it's a good with economic value, which you had transformed in a good with zero value. But it was worse than zero value because you had to dispose of the leather and you had to have a very contaminating and complex and expensive chemical process to basically, like, you know, like in Breaking Bad when they diluted the people, okay, like you have to do the same thing with the leather, okay?
So it had a cost.
Okay?
So it had a cost.
It has a cost. So you transform an economic good into an economic bad, okay? And then when Toto, at some point, he reduced the export taxes on leather to 0, that was all gone.
Of course.
And then the slaughterhouses could export and sell the leather. And they could reduce the price of meat because then now the cow has this additional value, which was the leather that which before was a cost, and now it's a benefit. Okay. So anyway, we had the most. It was the most amazing conversation because then a few weeks later, we did something which was we allowed the export of cattle live, which is very important if you want to open, for example, Middle Eastern and Arab countries market because they have their own slaughtering procedure. So they buy the cow live, not already dead, okay? For example, Brazil exports 700,000 units of cattle per year, Uruguay 250,000 live, okay? In Argentina, it was forbidden. Forbidden. Lobby of the slaughterhouses. Like everything, when you forbid the export, you reduce the lower prices, okay? So it was so funny because we did this with Pablo and the people at and Pasos, etc. And I happened to be at the chief of cabinet, Guillermo Francos, at the time, and then Guillermo Francos receives a call from Samid. I don't know if you know, Samid is a very famous guy which has a kind of informal slaughterhouse, okay? And he calls and says, oh, Samid. And I said, put him on speakerphone, okay? So, and then Samid said, oh, Guillermo, you have to eliminate this thing. It's going to destroy the industry. This is allowing the slaughterhouse. And so I get into the conversation and start saying, okay, well, so maybe we should forbid the export of soybeans, you know, and to say we should forbid the export of wheat or something, okay? And says, or maybe we should forbid the export of leather. I said, no, I supported that one. so anyway, so it's funny. We get all the stories. But for example, I remember this story because how do you measure the value of allowing for the live cattle? Because maybe in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, nothing happens. You have to build a market. You have to go there. You have to do the sanitary agreements with the country you're going to sell the live cattle. Now a guy is going to start selling to Senegal some live cattle. I tell you, tell me when you ship the first guys, I want to be there and take a picture, okay? But it's difficult sometimes to measure each deregulation because these things take time. You know, things take time to mature sometimes, no? And I was talking to Marcelo because I said Argentina should become the biggest producer of fertilizers in the world. I said, oh, I'm thinking about that. And I think Mariano Bosch, which is around here, also said, I'm thinking about that. But it takes time, you know. It's not that you push a button and then tomorrow you put up the plan. So anyway, but what we've been doing is totally comprehensive. It basically covers all the economy. This year, we're tremendously excited because now we can go back to Congress and to pass laws. There's a lot of deregulation that you can do at the level of disposition, decrease, etc. But if you can change the law, sometimes it opens up deregulations that are not possible otherwise. And we're in the work that we're basically taking the main agencies of the government and we've basically printed out all the regulations that they have, which is, for example, Además, which is our medical, the whole table, you know, full of paper with all. So now we're plowing through those regulations to generate a more compact and transparent regulation.
Do you sequence any of the reforms, or can you just do all of them at the same time?
All of them at the same time.
That's what I thought you said.
No, you know, because here I think there's something which I didn't mention in my presentation, which is the force of Javier Mille. So, I mean, none of this could happen if you don't have the political support and the communication of the president. And this is kind of different, as I think 15, 20 years ago, it would have been totally different. Because I'll give you an example. I say, I'm going to deregulate something. Remember, behind every regulation, there's an interest. So as soon as I announce I'm going to deregulate something, immediately the press smells blood. They say, oh, there's a conflict here. Okay, it's news. It gets on the news, and the President Mille, 5 minutes later, retweets supporting the deregulation. And then that's game over. Because it's like we say here, for those who are, it's tiré el ancho de espada. Okay, or he threw the ancho de espada. Because then the regulation says, who am I going to lobby? if number one has already, so I tell Javier, you've seen Javier, how generous he is with his team. Of course, if you make a mistake, you may get beheaded, okay? But a good CEO is...
But at least you can export the head now.
For example, if you go to tell Mille, I want to increase government expenditure, you know that the possibility of beheading is extremely high, okay? So that's why it doesn't happen. So, well, a good CEO has to have this balance, no? Clarity, empowerment, delegation, but at the same time, supervision, no? So, and I think Javier, I don't know where he learned it, but it's amazing in his role as the CEO of this team, no? And so I lost the track of what I was saying. So basically, you say, and then he goes on Twitter. So I say, Javier, maybe you do it because you want to support us, because you're generous, but it's like you're walking ahead of me with your machete. So you're kind of clearing the path with the machete, and that allows the rest of us as a team to come behind with the bulldozer. But we're only able to come with the bulldozer because you cleared the path before us, no? And so, I mean, listen, when are we going to get a guy like Mille? With this conviction, with this willingness, with this freedom to pursue the ideas of freedom. And so I'm not going to wait any sequencing. I'll try to do as much as I can in the time that I have.
And what has surprised you most as you take apart the government and the regulations? And
yeah, I'll tell you what surprised me most. The thing that surprised me most is the resistance of the status quo. I'll take an example. I won't give names just out of, just to not polemize. You get a product. You get regulatory rents of $4 billion on one product during 20 years. Why? Because the government set up a regulation that say you're the only guy who can sell in this product. Then a government comes and says, that's it, this is it. No? Like Javier said yesterday, it's over. Now we're going to have deregulation, we're going to have competition. We're not going to ask you for the $4 billion that you had of regulatory rents. But now we're going to change the system. Now we want to have competition, we want the prices to come down. And the guys fight and fight and fight and fight and fight relentlessly to avoid the deregulation. I said, wow, weird. I mean, you've already got $4 billion. Turn the page, the system changed, we move into a different scenario, but they're not willing to accept that. And I think, for example, going back to the example of Paolo Rocca, I think, which I think is, I mean, I say we have few world-class entrepreneurs. I mean, Paolo Rocca has shown that in the rest of the world, he can operate with the rules of the rest of the world as a world-class entrepreneur. So why operate with different rules in Argentina, in their own country, in the country that saw them grow and born and be the platform for them to grow internationally? Why a different rule there than a different rule here? So I think, for example, when we had this issue about the tubes, I think it was a great opportunity for Rocca to say, okay, we turn the page. This is a new system. We need competition. We need our inputs to be cheap. We're never going to be competitive. And we didn't get that kind of reaction. And I think it's a pity. I think probably we'll get it eventually. But I mean, if our world, if the few entrepreneurs that we have world class don't embrace this, that surprises me. Because in the long term, the business proposition that this government is making is tremendously positive for the business. Much more interesting, much more value than staying kind of hunting in the zoo in a very compartmentalized and small, tiny market. So this, Susan, surprises me a lot. I would have thought that they would embrace these new ideas and this new openness and in a more straightforward and more, but I say out of self-interest. Because I think our firms in an integrated Argentina are going to be worth much more than in a zoo, in a small zoo. But they seem to be so afraid, or no, they want to keep the zoo. Then of course you have the resistance of the bureaucracy, which I think perhaps is not as surprising. But that's difficult to manage. Now, for example, I'll tell you this story. You want to change a truck? you have to do it in an authorized, because it's going to a vehicle which is going to be in the roads, you have to do it in an authorized thing, okay? In an authorized dealership by the government. And then after that, it says, please wrap up, thank you, okay? But anyway, let me finish. And then you have to do something which is a VTV, which is the technical verification of the vehicle, which is also a government. So Alberto Fernandez at some point said, well, in the middle, we're going to have you have to get certificación del modelo. So you had to go to some guys, and these guys had to give you a certificate that it was fine. In the middle, correct? So you had a government authorized thing, and then you go to a government authorized to check that everything was fine. And in the middle, you had to get a certificate so that you can put your truck on the road. Okay. These guys didn't have an office, so what happened is that people send in an email or a WhatsApp, and the guy says, okay, send me 300,000 pesos, and I send you the certificate. So it was basically a legal bribe supported by the government, implemented by Alberto Fernandez, which increased the cost, $200, $300 for each truck that you put on the road. So we eliminated that, and the day we eliminated that, the guys who manage the software system of the dealerships are these guys. So they propped up. So they brought down the legal, and they put it again as an illegal thing. And the guy who goes to do that truck thing, he doesn't know if we took it out or not. You have to pay, you pay, correct? And we learned about that only 4 months later. There's some investigation to be done there, okay? But so the bureaucracy resists also, all this kind of, that's why I say deregulation is the most anti-corruption policy that you can have. But I think that's not surprising, but it's, well, it takes a lot of effort because sometimes you have to go back and back and back and back, and the bureaucracy keeps trying to keep their small perks there.
With that, I think we have to wrap up. I think most of us could sit here and listen to your stories for the rest of the day, because they're critical to the future of Argentina and really for the peoples of Argentina. Absolutely. Because the bottom line of what you're doing is supporting what the minister, the Secretary of Finance, the Minister of Finance is doing, which is lowering prices and keeping inflation
Susan,
down.
Can you allow me to say something?
This is the infrastructure that supports lower prices.
No, President Mille says, Federico, really, we can't use this because this name was used by Maduro. But the real name of your ministry is the Ministry of Happiness.
Well, with that, it all ends. So thank you so much, and good luck.
Thank you, Susan.